Good afternoon, good morning, depending on your time zone, and welcome to our third event for the term. And it's actually coming right in the last week of term here in Oxford on our political thought seminar as part of the Middle East Centre's contemporary Islamic studies program. And it gives myself and Faisal Devji great pleasure to welcome two scholars from across the Atlantic who are really leaders in the study of religion and secularism to talk about this week's theme, the theme of religion. Our scholars are Elizabeth Shakman Hurd from Northwestern University and Rushain Abbasi from Stanford University. Beth, you'll be speaking about decolonizing the category of religion. Roshan, you'll be speaking about regulating religion in pre-modern Islamic governance. So we're going to be straddling historical range in the course of this hour and a half. And we'll start with yourself, Beth. So I'll give you a brief introduction. You'll be able to speak for 20 minutes. Roshan will then be able to speak for 20 minutes, and then we'll shift to a discussion. And we always tell participants, please feel free to put questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll come to them. So even midstream while you're listening, feel free to do that. And Faisal and I will basically coordinate a discussion afterwards. So very often, Beth and Rushain, Faisal and I take the privilege that we have as co-chairs of the panel to engage you both in discussion. And we thoroughly enjoy that process as well. But we usually try and get to everyone's questions as well. So without further ado, I'd like to briefly introduce Elizabeth Shakman Hurd. Beth is Professor of Political Science and Crown Chair in Middle East Studies at Northwestern University. She studies religion and global politics. She's a very prolific author and co-directs Talking Religion, Public Politics and the Media and Global Politics and Religion research groups at Northwestern University. Her recent public pieces, are Three Myths About Religion and Politics and Dangerous Logic at the Borders, Religion and the Travel Ban. It says here, Beth, and this is on your website, you're currently writing a book about the American border and as political theology, but I have a feeling that that's the book you were just showing us as having been published. No, so you are currently writing, but you're also working on, you've also published other recent work. Yes. Never a dull moment in your literary life, shall we say. So without further ado, I'd like you to introduce your topic of decolonizing the category of religion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Usaama. Thank you, Faisal. It's so good to see you, even only on the Hollywood Square screen. Rushain, very nice to meet you. Thank you for being here, and I look forward to connecting with you and engaging with your work as we go forward. So this is really a privilege and an honor for me to be here. Thank you for having me. So I've been asked to speak today about the category of religion, and I want to begin with two brief vignettes that illustrate the kind of thinking that I'm doing right now about decolonizing the category and some of the tensions that inhere in that process in particular. The first is from the Teaching Law and Religion Case Study Archive that I co-curate with Winifred Fowler-Sullivan. And it's a case that's based on the historical and anthropological work of Paul Johnson, who works in Brazil. The second will draw on historian Kate Ramsey's book on voodoo and power in Haiti. Each of these two vignettes, they're very short, is suggestive of the limits of the category of religion that we traffic in with such ease and facility in most of our everyday conversations. And specifically, the ways in which that category, in fact, imports and reflects and reinstantiates histories and relations of power that more often than not involve white Europeans asserting various forms of domination over peoples of color in colonial and post-colonial contexts. I'll then suggest that those contexts do remain with us today in some surprising ways, drawing on a very brief example from my own current work, my own research. So the first vignette, in 1870 in Brazil, Judge Miguel José Tavares received a letter which accused an Afro-Brazilian possession priest named Yuca Rosa of practicing false magic. Judge Tavares prosecuted Rosa for charlatanism and fraud, claiming he was attempting to immorally profit by representing himself as a bearer of false magical powers. With no legal definition of religion outside of the church, the specter of Rosa's syncretic and uncategorizable religion, the religion that falls outside the boundaries of the category of religion, raised a number of debates over what religion is and what it could be in Brazil at that time. Ultimately, he was convicted and sentenced to hard labor, and central to his conviction were fears of sexual deviance, material gain, and of his, quote, stealing from Catholicism for nefarious ends. He received 6 years of prison and hard labor. Now, the context in which that case arose was the rise of Spiritism in Brazil, a movement originating in France that was concerned with spirits and spiritual possession, and which became widespread in the 19th century. Its popularity among Afro-Brazilians in particular alarmed the colonial authorities, as Afro-religions and ritual gatherings producing states of possession were seen as potential sources of insurrection by the enslaved and lower classes. This is, of course, drawing on Paul Johnson's book on this topic, on possession. As these laws repressing the religious practices of Afro-Brazilians began to spread, the juridical regulation of religion intersected very closely with issues of sexuality, race, class, and power in this particular case of Yucca Rosa. Second vignette, during the US occupation of Haiti, which occurred between 1915 and 1934, the occupiers were concerned about potential political dissent and anti-colonial insurgency being expressed once again through indigenous religious practices. The Americans, as a result, drew a close association between what they called sorcery and popular insurgency. They framed sorcery as insurgency, and they enforced laws against les sortilèges, or spells, in the name of moral decency and as a way to consolidate American control over Haiti. To put it very bluntly, there is no religious freedom for sorcerer insurgents. There's also none for Catholics, by the way, in this context. These same anti-superstition campaigns against voodoo targeting materialism and paganism also targeted Catholicism. So there was a different grammar of policing in place at this time, a different grammar of regulation, different grammar of outcasting what is and what is not illegitimate religion. The occupiers' attempts to enforce moral decency were not understood, however, to involve the export or the establishment of religion. And this is important, I think. Instead, they were, and today, as my work has shown, they remain in US foreign policy in particular, entangled, deeply entangled with the promotion of universal values, the notions of a free market, of modern scientism, of democracy, of public health, the rule of law, and indeed religious freedom itself. This, of course, is part of a global story involving the invention of these modern ideals of religion, secularism, nation, and citizenship, which are all carefully and closely entangled with each other in ways that we need to examine in contextually specific ways. In his work on Spiritism in Brazil, Paul Johnson describes the effects of the purification of the mid-17th century category of religion, conceived as a properly civil religion, in dialogue with and in contrast with what he calls a proto-anthropological notion of spirit possession as civil danger. In a recent post on the blog Contending Modernities, Nelson Maldonado Torres wrote that whoever defines, identifies, and explains religion wields much power. We've known this for some time. We've all been students of Talal Asad. These vignettes compel us to ask, is it possible for scholars, practitioners, lawyers, decision makers, journalists to continue to use this term, religion, given its entanglements with colonialism, its dizzyingly complex legal lives, its complicity in hierarchies and histories of domination, many of which are also deeply racialized? Can we deploy this category anymore without simply reproducing these hierarchies, these forms of oppression that are represented in these vignettes, as well as in so much other work in this field? There's a brand new book just out called Errand in the Wilderness by Michael Graziano, which charts the religious governance affected through the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, which I think of as some of the best new work in this area, but there's a lot of it. Can we then do something other than say, we were wrong, Yucca Rosa and the Haitians deserve their religion too? This is a struggle, and I think we need to use the term very, very carefully. Modern rational religion was and remains famously defined by its lack of entanglement, its separation from both supernatural powers on the one hand and the secular state on the other. It is widely acknowledged that making religion across colonial contexts has involved condemning and often criminalizing practices described as superstition and witchcraft and magic. These powers are criminalized as dangerous, uncivilized, wild, premodern, thuggish, demonic, and dissenting. The state and its religions, meanwhile, become the domain of reason, statecraft, law, individual belief and non-belief, and modern forms of rational authority. Muddying that divide, troubling that divide between good and bad religion, between religion and non-religion, is part of my job. The challenge in decolonizing the concept of religion, then, will require more than merely including other practices into the category of religion and moving on. We need to think religion otherwise and carefully. I will give an example of a new book, Brent Crossan's new book, which is called Experiments with Power, Obeya and the Remaking of Religion in Trinidad, which I think accomplishes this very complex balancing act. Crossan studies Obeya, which he describes as a form of spiritual work or experiment with power. He sets out in his project at first to redeem it. He wants to show that it's really not all that bad. It's not all that dangerous. It's a good religion. And presumably he wants to kind of add it to the pantheon of protected and respected world religions, which is exactly the move that is often made in policy debates as well. Bring them into the interfaith dialogue. Now, what he learned was that this wasn't going to work. He had assumed that religion in its proper forms was exclusive of harm, and he wanted to morally vindicate its practitioners from the darker popular associations that went with it, which he saw as the product of course, its colonial and post-colonial denigration and criminalization, which is understandable. Obeya, after all, was a crime in Trinidad until 2000, and it remains one today in much of the Anglophone Caribbean. Crossan was drawn to what he calls the race-making powers of religion. And this is a complex idea that has to do with the race-based exclusion of African-identified practices from both sides of the secular religion's dialectic, which he identifies, this exclusion, as a foundational act in the making of religion and secularism as modern universals. So the terms themselves in this account are deeply racialized. Crossan concludes that the identification of evil with African, not religion, has been a key part of Western modernity's moral and racial discourse, particularly in representations of Obeya and voodoo for American, British, French, and West African audiences. Now, Vincent Lloyd and Jonathan Cahn make a similar claim in their excellent volume, Race and Secularism in America. And I think that the entanglement of racialization with the categories of secularism and religion needs to be a part of all of our discussions at this point. Now, Crossan's redemptive project of Obeya clearly runs into a wall. He says his interlocutors reverse the terms of that project. Rather than making Obeya into a religion, he says, they made me ask how spiritual work challenged the hegemonic limits of the category of religion itself. Forced outside the comfort of that category, he abandons his redemptive aims. And these are precisely the kind of moments, and they're kind of scary, because in what categories do you use to talk about what we do? Where are our jobs? What department do we work in? But these objects of study are challenging the hegemonic moral racial limits of our own received categories of analysis. And this is part of the challenge today. Religion is one such category. Of course, there are others as well. There's also some tension here. Eminent scholars such as Webb Keane and David Chittister have argued that we're not in any position to set aside these categories, religious and secular. They're part, as Keane suggests, both elite and everyday discourse, and they mediate self-awareness everywhere. They have themselves become social facts. Chittister agrees. After reviewing the history of religion's colonial productions on contested frontiers, he says, we might happily abandon religion and religious as terms of analysis if we were not, as the result of that very history, stuck with them. So the question is, are we stuck? The US is out of Haiti, at least this week, although certainly there are reparations to be paid. At the same time, the governing logics of the occupation endure, they persist when it comes to the moral racial limits of religion at home and abroad. I'll now turn finally to an example from my own current research on the American border. And I specifically will speak for a moment about Santa Muerte, or Holy Death, the unofficial patron saint of the marginalized, threatened, and the poor. She's a skeletal female figure clad in a long robe, and she's holding a scythe and a globe. You may have seen her represented. She also has kind of parallels in other traditions. La Santísima has this incredibly rich history, and I can't go into that here due to reasons of time. She has many devotees in the borderlands, the US-Mexican borderlands, and she also now has devotees all over North America. She offers protection from harm, And she serves as a reminder that no one, not even Customs and Border Protection, can escape death. She embraces those in limbo. She loves the naco, which is a pejorative Mexican Spanish word meaning low class and uncultured, which also carries anti-Indigenous and racialized connotations. She's also beloved by many sexual minorities. Historians and ethnographers often portray Santa Muerte as a sympathetic would-be saint of the downtrodden and leave it at that. US, Mexican, and law enforcement officials tell a very different story about her, though, and this is where I became interested. Echoing their forefathers who occupied Haiti a century ago, they depict La Santísima as a threat to American and Mexican national security. She is maligned by the Catholic Church as a form of idol worship, if not the devil itself. She is vilified by Mexican-American law enforcement as a folk saint of the drug cartels, and criminalized as a death cult by the US Foreign Military Studies Office, and a source of spiritual insurgency, their term. If I may, I'm just going to share my screen here and pull up a slide of Santa Muerte. Okay, this is La Santísima, and everywhere you go, increasingly here in Chicago as well, you can find all kinds of devotional items to La Santísima, also known as La Flaquita, the skinny girl. In my own local grocery store, I have found this candle, this vela, which is lit, one lights and says the prayer, which is written in Spanish on the back. La Santísima is absolutely everywhere. She is ubiquitous. Let me just show one more photo, if I may, which is taken last week in Nogales, which is a town on the border of the United States and Mexico in southern Arizona and northern Sonora. And this is a saint, a temple to Santa Muerte, where everyone is invited to come for the rosary every Sunday at 12 noon. So you get, she's ubiquitous, is just to give you a sense with her globe and her scythe. So let me just give you a little bit of the flavor of the fear that she inspires. One expert, American law enforcement, described devotion to her as spiritual insurgency that involved worship of a perverted Christian God. This has made its way into the American courts as well, and I'll tell this story in a longer version of this, but there are court records showing that there are prayer recitations, prayer books, statuettes, and even skeleton emblazoned air fresheners for your car that are now being used as evidence in efforts to detain and convict suspects. Another expert has described her connection with the revival of human sacrifice in Mexico, and specifically worship of the female Aztec god of the dead. So I'm interested in exploring some of the anti-Indigenous elements of the persecution of devotees of Santa Muerte in particular. So for law enforcement, her followers are anti-religion, they use that term, anti-orthodox, and anti-law and order. While some in the drug trade may engage in non-religious killing, for followers of Santa Muerte, it is impossible. All killing is religious. In the eyes of law enforcement, devotees have fallen prey to bad religion, exacerbated by a childlike attraction to pagan ways that conduces to violence. So she poses a kind of spiritual threat by marshaling these dangerous and subversive indigenous, pagan, dark-skinned forces against US law enforcement. And this racially tinged fear of the cult threads through a master's thesis written for the US Marine Corps University in Quantico. And I just want to give you one quote from that. The thesis itself is called Santa Muerte, Threatening the US Homeland, which sums it up. And the author warns Santa Muerte is in and of itself a religion incompatible to good order and discipline. It promotes a society of lawbreakers. And then he goes on to trace the forms of devotion to the failure to codify Aztec religion. And he contrasts that with canon law in Catholicism. He says the problem is Aztec religion has no written doctrine, but traditions passed on through word of mouth and ritualistic practice, making the belief system susceptible to the damaging effects of individual interpretation. So he says that basically the Mexican people who worship Santa Muerte, they got this kind of embedded into the principles of their belief. This is obsession with death and mysticism that they inherited from the indigenous predecessors to the Spanish colonials. And due to the lack of doctrine, the lack of a written doctrine in specific, the narco cultures have picked this up and then run with it and developed their own nefarious interpretations of reverence of Santa Muerte. So if this slippery cult could have been pinned down and written down, he says, things might have come together differently. But the bottom line is right now what we're facing is societal collapse. Now, I think I'm going to wrap up here and just say that I think that it'd be really easy to dismiss these perspectives as ignorant and or naive, but that they actually put people in jail for life in many of these cases. And so while that may be tempting, there are a lot of people who are suffering as a result of these understandings and these interpretations and these criminalizations of Santa Muerte worship. It's also possible to read her slightly differently and to understand the forms of insurgency and religiosity that she represents as a form of agency of political and religious solidarity and transformation that recalls earlier figures such as Our Lady of Guadalupe, who some of you may know first appeared in 1531 to the newly colonized indigenous peoples of Mexico and became associated herself with a Nahuatl deity named Tonantzin. According to Luis Leon, and like Santa Muerte, Guadalupe decimated the border between European and Native American religions through processes of syncretism, continuity, and transformation. In a new article in which he charts the contributions of indigenous political thought to the Mexican Revolution, Arturo Chang describes the revolutionaries' efforts to reclaim Catholicism itself as simultaneously indigenous, Mexican, and Pan-American. I think this is part of the future of the study of the category of religion, which is why I'm highlighting it here in conclusion. And he wants to retell the whole history of Mexican republicanism through this focus on marginalized groups that had envisioned their own post-colonial emancipation in collective indigenous terms. Radical republicanism and indigenous demands came together in a restorative moment that demonstrated what Chang calls the influence of indigeneity, religion, and plebeian politics on Republican political thought. Like her revolutionary forebears, and with Chang's work in mind, we might ask if devotion to Santa Muerte also represents another indigenization of borderlands, religion, and politics and formation. Her popularity surely exceeds her status as a demonized icon of death or a pitiable pseudo-saint of the dispossessed. Confounding the line between pure and impure religion, her celebrations are marked by an openness to the exorbitant, the unsettled, even the monstrous. Beyond the reach of church and state, she's a repository of anti-colonial, anti-racist, and indigenous agency. Her followers could be seen to represent a new indigenous ecclesia in the sense described by Pamela Klassen, Paul Johnson, and Winnie Sullivan in their new book by that name, Ecclesia, a collective imbued with charisma that stands apart from the hegemony of both church and state, one that is composed of the interpenetrating and mutually constitutive forces of religion, law, and politics. Now, to assimilate Santa Muerte into our pantheon of world religions would clearly be a mistake. Her devotees sit outside the secular religious dialectic. It is even perhaps irrelevant to them. How can we do them justice without reducing them to the categories from which they have been and continue to be violently excluded? Decolonizing religion requires telling a series of different stories, not only about religion then, but also about law, politics, and indeed history. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Beth. Really sort of a journey into a world of religion that is unfamiliar to many of us, but truly illuminating. I'm going to quickly, and thank you also for keeping to time so well, exactly 20 minutes. I'm going to, in the interest of time and the subsequent discussion, move straight on to Roshan's sort of presentation regulating religion in pre-modern Islamic governance. Rushain Abbasi is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in humanities and lecturer in the Department of Religious Studies at Stanford University. He received his PhD from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University in 2021, where his dissertation was awarded the prestigious Al-Walid bin Talal Prize for Best Dissertation in Islamic Studies. And for those of us who've seen it, we really think it was a thoroughly deserved recognition of its brilliance. He formerly served as an associate research scholar at the Abdullah S. Kamel Center for Islamic Law and Civilization at Yale Law School. And without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to you, Rushain.
Sure, thank you so much. Let me just share my screen. Oh, thank you both, and thank you, Beth, for this fascinating talk, and I feel, though I'm doing something very different and working on an entirely different historical context, I feel we align very closely in terms of our ethical objectives and even the ways in which we think about secularism. And precisely what I'll try to do today is to think religion otherwise by telling these other stories and histories, this one indigenous to the Islamic context, not only as a way of helping contemporary Muslims think through these issues and how these categories have worked in their own context, but also what I'm really trying to do here is to use the example of the pre-modern Islamic past to think through some issues around secularity, particularly within the field of secularism studies, which I think is a new way of moving forward to expand the horizons of our thinking beyond the modern or Euro-Atlantic centric view, which has naturally been at the forefront of secularism studies. So today I'll be talking about regulating religion in pre-modern Islamic governance, as you'll see from the subtitle, as a tool for thinking through the problems of secularity. So let me just get right into it. Essentially, what I'm trying to do is to offer historical intervention into theory, which isn't to say to use the hammer of history to delegitimize theoretical findings, but to problematize certain assumptions within the field and to think through various of these issues as a way of helping me understand the Islamic past, actually. So briefly, and this is something which I think we all know, what the advances in secular studies have taught us very clearly is that what we're really talking about when we think about secularism is the management and regulation of religion. And that, of course, is itself a category that's indebted to a distinctively Christian genealogy. And I think even in the modern Islamic context, when you come across these terms, there's no way in which they're not inflected by this Western genealogy, given how pervasive the West is. It is perhaps the major, if not the central element of the operation of secularism. And now I'm completely sympathetic to this view, but what I want to do today is to incorporate this non-Western pre-modern perspective on quote unquote religion in order to complicate certain of these assumptions that I've seen within the field. And again, it's only to complicate them, to help us better understand them, not to necessarily undermine them, because I've found so much value in each of these perspectives. So the first point I'll look at is this idea of secularism as a kind of questioning power, which I find very compelling. This features in the works of Hussein Ali Agrama in his book, Questioning Secularism. And it's a questioning power that's driven by this sort of indeterminacy at the heart of secularism around this religious secular divide, or as Beth alluded to, good and bad religion. The second is the understanding of legal secularization. And here I'm really thinking about this wonderful volume, After Secular Law, which I think Winnie Sullivan and others edited as the kind of ascension of a sort of Christian sovereignty. So there are these excellent articles in there talking about this longer genealogy of the very notion of secular law. And so I want to think through that with the case of Islam. And then the last issue has to do with universality and particularity, and which I think is really at the core of much of our debates surrounding secularism. And I've always found a problem in trying to figure out precisely what's going on here. And what I'll try to do today is to use Islam to think through some of these issues a little bit more clearly. So how I'll proceed is I'll look at three case studies. So looking at a sort of philological, historical question within pre-modern Islam, and then thinking about the theoretical implications. And this is really a work in progress. I'm thinking of writing this shorter book that's oriented towards the field of secularism studies. So I'm really looking forward to your comments and feedback. So the first case study centers on the question of what makes an act of witnessing religious. So witnessing is this all-important institution in all pre-modern forms of governance, really, because you don't have sort of modern forms of forensic evidence and these sorts of things. So the witness plays this all-important role in court proceedings. So one of the things that I encountered in my reading of Islamic law is that the Muslim jurists who are the functionaries at these imperial courts, they continuously debated this question in their legal handbooks, and as I'll show, even outside of them, about how and where to draw the lines between the dini and the dunyawi forms of hostility and enmity, adawa. And in short, really the question is this: you know, if you have a witness who's harboring some sort of hostility or some sort of enmity towards a plaintiff or defendant, this obviously delegitimizes their testimony. And for various reasons, they had to separate these sorts of categories of enmity, right? So at one level, a dini or religious form of hostility was perforce legitimate, precisely because non-Muslims, for example, were not allowed to take a stand. Also because religious forms of animosity are legitimate in an Islamic polity, obviously. It's sort of embedded deeply in the Quran, one might say. This sort of drawing of lines of distinction between these communities and even harboring some sort of enmity or hostility towards someone else's religion. But at the same time, this posed a problem for these jurists in their functioning of the courts, because they needed to separate out secular forms of hostility in which, for example, as we'll see, people hate a certain person because of the tribe they're from, or so on and so forth. So basically, they wanted to exclude the latter, this dunyawi form of hostility, from this sort of illegitimate form of testimony for pragmatic reasons, to protect sort of justice within the court proceedings, while also sanctioning the former for ideological reasons. So this goes back to a textual basis. Shafi, this foundational jurist, speaks of conflict as giving way to hostility, adawa. So one of the commentators on in the Shafi school, and I would say the Shafi school had the most sophisticated reflections on this particular question. Abul Hussein Imrani, who lives in the 12th century, he divides between the dini and dunyawi as so many of these other jurists do. And he, for example, looks at the issue of partisanship, of asabiya. And again, he delimits it to the secular. So he says a secular form of asabiya, whether it's tribal, ethnic, whatever it might be, is perforce illegitimate in courts. But an asabiya that's based on religious grounds is necessarily protected, precisely because Muslims might harbor hostility towards Jews or Christians on the basis of their religion, but nevertheless they have to serve in the courts proffering testimony, or else the courts will not be able to function. And just to give an example of how this was not simply a kind of theoretical construct, but actually made its way into the courts, this Shurut handbook by Shamsuddin al-Asyuti, this 15th century Egyptian Shafi scholar, Jawahir al-Aqud, he actually replicates the official formula, the mahdar here, which is required for documentary purposes within the Mamluk courts. And the statement which he includes here as to the proposed witness is that he is hostile on to so-and-so on secular grounds. Annahu adu li fulan al-fulani adawa dunyawiya. So it became a term that actually, I think, became the documentary and the legitimate way of speaking about hostility. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that for the purposes of legal governance, pre-modern Muslims actually had to, in the course of legal proceedings, divide between the religious and secular for particular political purposes, pragmatic, ideological. And this, I think, serves as a useful case for thinking about secularity in today's day and age, which is, of course, has often been approached through the perspective of law, as, for example, Professor Hurd and others have done. So in thinking about this, I started to, drawing on Hussein Agrama and the work of David Scott, think about the problem space of dunya, right? And the problem space, as David Scott construes it, is essentially the sort of constellation of questions and answers upon which certain ideological and political stakes hang. And this is obviously historically conditioned. There's a temporal element to it. There's no universal working at play in this equation. And so I thought, what are the stakes here in the question of the dunya in the legal courts? And the way I would elucidate it is that the deen-dunya binary, in this case at least, emerges as a sort of theoretical construct. And importantly, within a distinctively and self-aware Islamic tradition, this is long before the advent of European influence, as a theoretical construct used to address practical issues emerging from the problem of religious plurality. So we see at the core of it is the question of religious plurality. This is not something that is sort of invented anew in the modern European world, but it's something that I think, and I'll argue later, actually goes back to the Sasanian and to the Roman empires, and the Islamic one being a novel development in this longue durée. So what we see then, if we think about this comparatively, and this is the kind of work I think I'm doing, one might describe it as archaeological in the Foucauldian sense of doing a sort of comparative analysis, as opposed to the modern regime of the secular, right, in which the RS divide, the religious secular divide, obtains a distinctive salience. This is how Agrama describes it, and I think it's the right way of doing it, and even a sort of centrality to the political order. And I think Professor Hurd was alluding to this as well. Those notion of social order hangs on this divide and this dividing process. The Islamic problem space is merely a problem space of the dunya, is merely a tool of governance rather than a tool of governmentality. And here I'm talking about governmentality a la Foucault. And that's precisely because it lacks this ideological hegemonic function, if we think about that term as Gramsci uses it. Here we see it as a sort of pragmatic form of governance, a tool that's, I speak about it here as a kind of product or either a product or a tool of lawmaking, rather than being the very foundation of law. And this, going back to that volume After Secular Law, it really shows that the very foundation of secular law is this sort of problem space. And so what I think this helps us do, it helps us clarify the distinctiveness of modern secularity as we bring it into broader relief, historically speaking. It highlights the very pervasiveness rather than this sort of secularizing strategy, which one finds in medieval historical context. And here I will also highlight the work of Conor O'Brien, a historian at Oxford in the history department, who's written quite a bit about the medieval Christian Western secular. And he's developed this idea of secularizing strategies as a sort of a pragmatic form of differentiating between religion and non-religion in the Western case, which I also see in the medieval Islamic case. And we could think about this as a form of secularity that might be more conducive to governance in terms of grappling with the problem of religious plurality, rather than a kind of rhetorical ideological use of secularity, which is precisely what one encounters in reading the law in America, or reading the law in Europe, and so on and so forth. I'll move on to my second case study now. And of course, there's a lot to unpack here, and hopefully we can do that in the Q&A. Well, what is one to do when beliefs collide with principles of social order? This is, of course, a central question when we think about secularism today. And to stick with the theme of witnessing, I look now at this another 11th century scholar, a very important one from the Hanafi school, as-Sarakhsi, who's a canonical figure in the Hanafi school. So he also talks about witnessing in a different context, and he tells us a very expected thing, that heretics, usually in the Islamic tradition, we understand that heretics cannot transmit religious traditions, right? They can't serve as reliable witnesses to the testimony of religious evidence, right? Because of their religious corruption. But what's interesting is he argues that heretics can, in fact, take the stand in a court on a secular basis when they're not speaking to religious matters. And the way in which he formulates it is this, he says, witnessing is a part of the realm of injustices and disputes, taghalam, khusumat, and the heretic with respect to these matters is not partisan, right? So it goes back to this question of bias, of partisanship. And it's interesting the way he formulates this, because I've done a lot of other work on this in my the book I'm writing now. But this category of tadhalim, of injustice and khusumat, it's often invoked in the context of distinguishing it from the religious realm or the realm of ibadat. It's seen as a sort of civil realm in which, for example, Sharia can apply to non-Muslims, even as the ritual aspects of law cannot. This element can, precisely because it's predicated on justice, this kind of universal justice, really, in the way in which they're construing it. And subsequently, this is a different point, but it also helps us think through these issues. He clarifies in a different vein that believing in divine inspiration, ilham, right? This is a very popular category of God's essentially, revealing the truth to you via a dream or even awake. If one believes that this sort of this knowledge that one receives is a socially practicable form of knowledge, right? That one can sort of speak of it and use it as a basis of knowledge in courts, renders one's testimony invalid, precisely on account of holding this false belief. So even the way they're talking about it, i'tiqad, is a very pervasive category. So because they're holding on to this belief, it invalidates their testimony because of the problems it poses to social order, right? There's sort of epistemic unsettling that's happening here, and they're aware of it and they're grappling with it. So it aligns in some ways, but also diverges from, for example, Rule 610 of the U.S. Federal Rules of Evidence, which I'm sure Professor Hurd and others are familiar with. While the rule forecloses inquiry into the religious beliefs or opinions of a witness for the purpose of showing that his character for truthfulness is affected by their nature, which is precisely sort of what we're seeing here, an inquiry for the purpose of showing interest or bias because of them is not within the prohibition. So this is a very complicated rule here where you're able to sort of look into religion as it pertains to this particular individual as a way of, figuring out bias, but it's precluding a kind of deeper engagement with their religious beliefs as a way of invalidating the truthfulness of their testimony. Well, what we see here is precisely that sort of thing. And I'll talk about this in a second, but it helps us, I think, understand what's really going on here. And so I'm thinking about the potentials and also the limits of legal secularization. So what's interesting about what I think is happening with Sarakhsi here is he's helping us actually see the sort of paradoxical nature of secularity, of secularization. So how I describe it is this, that in his aspiration to secularize the legal realm, in which I mean to exclude certain types of religious beliefs from functioning within this secular kind of regime of the law, by removing these sort of quote unquote questionable religious beliefs, he falls in this kind of paradoxical secularism of his own making, akin to what we find in the modern period, right? One which undermines its own neutrality precisely in the effort to produce a neutral public realm, right? So this is sort of catch-22 of secularism, right? In the process of creating neutrality, you have to draw those boundaries. You have to ask these questions, which are at the very heart of this problem space, right? And I think this is a useful way of characterizing the problem space of secularism. If we think of it, and here I'm just sort of thinking out loud and creatively, if we think of it functionally in terms of the role it plays in managing human society. And the reason I put functionality at the forefront here is because I am thinking about this, in a problem space that is very distinct, right? The questions and the answers that are being produced are hinged on very different epistemological assumptions, very different conceptions of the human, right? Yet we still see the same sorts of grappling within the enterprise of governance. And that's why I think this sort of functional perspective might be a useful way of pursuing this. What tells us is that it's somewhat universal, and I use this word very carefully, and I'd probably not even want to use it, but that we find it in other contexts. And this is, I think, an important move for us because it helps us move beyond our perspective, our kind of Eurocentric perspective when we think about secularism, that it can't be comprehensively explained with reference to modernity. There's other things I can do with this, but let me just conclude with one last example because I know we're short on time, although we started late. There's a very quick question here. Does Islamic law apply to non-Muslims? It's a very important question that jurists are thinking about throughout the ages. And here I take a quote from Anwar Oman's book on Islamic law, in which he says, quote, "The dhimmi constituted a certain factual reality that contributed to delimiting the claim space of Sharia," which I think is a very useful way of thinking about the Sharia, right? And the thing that I find historically that happens in the medieval period around between the 9th and the 12th century, is that we see this gradual move towards restricting religious communities to the regulation of non-civil internal affairs, right? And this is akin to what I see in reading about colonial law in some ways, in a kind of essential way, it's sort of overlapping, right? That you have this process of communalization, right? That communities have now to regulate, delimit themselves to the regulation of their internal affairs, which are precisely ritualistic, having to do with the ritualistic elements of marriage, of inheritance. And these are the same categories that jurists are using. And it's actually the same sort of categories we find under the Sasanians, under the Romans as well, with reference to the Jews. And so I see this as a process of sort of imperial governance, right? But again, my point is not that it's the same thing. It's to say that this comparative work can help us think about what's distinctive about this modern process. And the doctrinal basis for it, here's one quote from Kasani, important Hanafi jurist: "We are commanded by God to leave them to their own religious beliefs, ma ya'taqidun or ma yadinun," right? The beliefs they hold on to or what they confess. Again, this category of belief is also here, and I'm sort of thinking through what that's doing. But in terms of the theoretical implications, and I'll conclude with this, Julia Stevens has written this wonderful book about colonial law in the Islamic context within India, and she speaks of secular governance, legal governance, as the quote, the cumulative power of laws and normative scripts in defining newly divided spheres of religious and secular governance, right? And I think it's a wonderful definition. Though, as you'll see, I struck out newly here. Now, I think newly works in one way in the sense that there's a new division taking place here, which I call the kind of reinvention of the religious secular divide, which is based on a new cumulative power of laws, normative scripts, right? And that's what I think is really distinctive here. But for example, the close association of religion with domestic and ritual matters, right? I don't think was a colonial innovation. I think, again, it's something that I've already found in my reading of Islamic law, even in the late antique world. And I think it actually coheres with this widely spread view that I find in the writers that I'm reading, of the inherent universality of the dunyawi as opposed to the particularity of the dini. This is something I work a lot on I think a lot about in my book, but they often align with the dunyawi, either as a kind of epistemic category of secular knowledge, or in the terms of the dunyawi as a kind of legal category with something that is supra-confessional, right? As opposed to the dini, which is culturally particular, which is based on, cultural norms that are unique to one's own sort of history. And so I'll conclude with this. What's really changed here is that under the modern secular order, the particularity of religion is no longer maintained, right? And here we can think of Hegel, we can think of so many examples in the early modern European period, right? So now the religious itself is now subject to the forces of Christianization and Westernization, right? And this is where I absolutely agree with Professor Hurd, that this manifests in a racialized and gendered way. And that's precisely because, and I'll conclude with this, I agree here with George Shulman's idea, and this is part of his contribution in Race and Secularism in America. He critiques Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt will say liberalism, liberal secular order has no political theology. And what he, I think, compellingly argues is that, no, there's precisely a political theology. It's a racialized political theology. And that's what we are now realizing in every manifestation that we look at, whether it's with Muslims in Europe or with precisely these Atlantic cases that Professor Hurd's looking at. There's this racialized Christian, Western, white supremacist order upon which hinges this problem space, right? And part of what's happening here is I think that this particularity of religion has been tossed out and the universality has sort of pervaded all domains rather than this dunyawi domain, which I see here, which I think is a far more robust conception and one that, allowed for this, precisely these complex spaces, communities to function and thrive indeed. I'll close with that, and I hope I haven't sort of lost you in all of these thoughts. I'm just really thinking through recently, but I'm really happy I had this opportunity to do it, and I look forward to the conversation, and apologies for the time I've taken. Thanks.
Thank you, Roshan, for really a fantastic and extremely rich presentation. I think it got us all thinking a lot. And I think I'm happy to hand over potentially to Faisal if you want to conduct the Q&A portion of this, but I just want to start by reminding everyone that we do have these two wonderful scholars for the next 40 minutes or so. And so if anyone has any questions, now's the time to ask. As panelists, we also have our own questions. But I'll hand over to Faisal because I really feel like I've had the privilege to sort of take things to this point.
Well, thanks, Usaama. Thanks very much, Rushain and Beth. Really both wonderful presentations, so much squeezed in to so little time. I only wish we had more time, but of course, Zoom you can only do for 2 hours maximum, I find, and we won't even keep you for 2 hours. Perhaps I can begin with a question one for you, Beth, and then one for you, Rushain, and then we can, Usaama, I'm sure will chip in, and then we'll get questions slowly filtering in from the audience. So Beth, I took you to say that in a way religion as a category is only possible universally, even though where the universal belongs is disputed. So religion is an abstract universal category in its own right, like the state, like the secular. So in some ways, they're all part of the same, on the same plane in some strange way, even though you want to make distinctions between them. between universal and particular, but of course those two categories are dependent one on the other, that, you you can't have the particular without the universal. It's simply a moment of the universal in say, a Hegelian sense. And in that sense, they're all part, if you will, of a secular order. And the question Santamuerte raises, which I find so interesting, is not simply the recognition of what you, I think, very rightly say about the problem with the category religion, but how do you actually think the non-universal? This goes back to Webb Keene's critique in another way, whereas he would say that, well, we've all inherited the category religion, so it's already part of our life worlds. What do we do? In a way, my point is not that. It's like, once you already have the universal, how do you unthink it? Do you need to unthink it? How is it possible to think the non-universal? And why this interests me is because in some other work I've been doing on Gandhi as a political thinker, he very deliberately comes to this question as, in part, someone who identifies as a Hindu, Hinduism being a religion, if you want to call it that does not, in his view, permit conversion. So it is a non-expansive religion. We can argue whether that was correct or not, but in his view, and it makes him think about how Hinduism does or does not belong in the category religion itself, alongside, say, Islamic Christianity as expansive religions. But it's not just religion that he's talking about. He also questions humanity as a universal category. And for him, I've come to the provisional conclusion that he then plays with negative ideas. And so many of Gandhi's ideas are negative: ahimsa, non-violence, non-cooperation, non-possession, where you presume the positive, but you never start with it. It's always the negative that you begin with. And again, in a Hegelian sense, negative is the principle of movement and dynamism in general. But what you're suggesting is something that seems similar and yet quite different with Santamuerte. You ended, Beth, by talking about let me quote it, how it decimates the border. I found that such a striking phrase, because of course it's not just the US-Mexican border, but which is what you also made a border between the universal and the particular, between religion and the secular, all kinds of borders. But that doesn't do the kind of Gandhian negative. It rather seems to shift the phenomenon away from the language game of universal and particular, which are conjoined anyway. But apart from saying this is something different, it cannot be talked about in terms of the religious and the non-religious, the religious and the secular, the cultic and the religious, or whatever. How might you characterize it, say, in contrast with this kind of Gandhi's negative approach to the problem? Sorry, it's a rather lengthy question due to the kind of richness of your presentation.
Thank you so much, Faisal. I think it's a very important question. How to characterize it, I think, I'm not sure. And maybe I need to look into some of those Gandhian resources that would be helpful in characterizing it. I would say that part of the challenge, or as I search for resources for thinking through how to do precisely what you're describing, is actually related to what Rushain is talking about, in fact, which is what your talk brought to mind, Rushain, was this very important necessity of kind of making two moves at once, which is the kind of parochialization of liberal ideals on the one hand, and that may be in some ways, that the process of parochialization may in some ways be related to the Gandhian sensibility that Faisal is describing. I'm not sure. But on the other hand, it's also a reworking and a refashioning from the inside of those very ideals, so that they are no longer recognizable. And in that sense, that touches on what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm mistaken, what I'm hearing from you, Shane, which is this Dunoyer domain, which is a very different, rather refashioned understanding of the secular that has different ethos, a different sensibility, different aspirations, and a very different understanding rigidities of the problem space that it is creating and that is instantiating vis-a-vis the religious. So what I think, I mean, there's more than one move then that needs to be made. And as I was listening to Rushain and as I was listening to you, Faisal, on your question, I kept thinking about two thinkers, which is William Connolly's work on the ethos of pluralization, which is very good at making those precisely those kind of centering, particularizing moves, but very much with a certain kind of ethos, a certain kind of mode of engagement, which also brings to mind Nadia Marzouki's work. And Rushain, I thought of her specifically when you were speaking, and her argument in her book, Islam in America, which some of you may be familiar with. She has a powerful conclusion at the end in which she argues for the need to disconnect the liberal ideal, the liberal secular ideal, but the liberal ideal in general, from the very exclusive norms and codes that it's become tied to. So there's a sense in which there is an internal refashioning, a stepping back, a sense of humility, kind of tempering of the arrogance that reminded me of precisely the ideal of Dunoyer that you were describing, Rushain, if I'm not misunderstanding it. And so I feel like the universal particular only gets us so far here. And so I'm very sympathetic to that gesture that you're suggesting, this Gandhian move. And I'm not sure how I would read Santa Muerte through that prism or through that lens, but I do think that it will involve not only, kind of listening and trying to understand these alternative religiosities and forms of political agency, just kind of from the outside, but actually actively reforming what Nadia calls the ensemble of codes and norms of exclusion that have become so closely associated with liberal order, in which, this Rule 610 of the US Federal Policy of Evidence is one of the main rules that gets cited in these cases. And they're kind of trying to parse that language that Rushain had read and put on the screen for us. And that those kinds of that language can obviously be read a lot of different ways. And it's a question of how it's read and by whom and which context. And I think that those small differences and those shifts in the level of arrogance and the level of presumption and the level of presumed liberal hegemony are going to be really important. But tell me what I need to read about this Gandhian sensibility, and maybe it'll give me a whole new understanding of Santa Muerte. I'd be most happy. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I think, the Santa Muerte example really teaches us a great deal, obviously, and I'm looking forward to your book once it comes out. But I don't know, Rushain, I don't know if you, since Beth referred to your talk, whether you would like to enter this conversation. Then I have another question for you as well, and as I'm sure there's Usaama.
Sure. I mean, I think you can go ahead. I mean, I'm just, I'm very glad to hear this, and I think you helped me think through some of the things I'm trying to do. I mean, I precisely am. I think the primary motivation in doing this kind of work was to add that extra move that I thought was not, that I felt very deeply and very personally, I felt like I needed to do. And I haven't seen Nadia Marzouki's book, and I'm looking forward to reading it. But it's precisely this sort of refashioning that I think is strategically a useful way, a valuable way for us to move forward as well, right? Because it does, I think it even, I mean, not even more so, probably equally so, it unsettles these codes that underwrite the language we use and the way in which these laws, like as you mentioned, are interpreted. So it's in this act of refashioning that I think, especially if you have a whole movement of people doing this sort of thing, which I think at least I'm noticing is taking place now in the academy and even outside. I think that's a really valuable way of moving forward. So I really appreciate the way in which you describe my project of the Dunoyer as sort of bringing attention to this very different ethos and sensibility and aspiration that informs a similar kind of project, but from a very different perspective that can trouble our way of proceeding, right? And I think I would just add that doing it from the Islamic perspective is the most unsettling sort of a way of moving forward, because and disturbing, precisely because Islam is at the very heart of this project of secularism. I mean, in the sense of it being the great other of secularism, and I think that's what also was provoking me so much in my reading of the sources, is that it did not map on even to the sort of modern rehabilitation of Islam, which obviously emerged out of a colonial dialectic between Orientalists and modern nationalists, who for good reasons had to develop, projects of Islamic modernity that were going to be effective within their societies, but of course, fell into the trap of being encoded by this this larger logic, right? And I think I think the moment we're in now, that we're able to sort of move beyond that and think about historicizing these sorts of things, the particularity not only of the Islamic, but obviously of course of the secular and the Western. And so yeah, this has been super helpful, and yeah, Faisal, I'd be very interested in hearing your question, and Usaama and the others. So thanks.
Thanks, Rushain. I was thinking when you were speaking, it's very new stuff. So I'm really, I just wanted to congratulate you for allowing us to think in these ways. But when you were talking about the deen and dunya distinction, for instance, in contrast to the religion and the secular one of our time, I realize you're not making a fundamental distinction between them. The religion-secularism distinction of our times is often understood in spatial terms, not always, but very often. The public space of the secular and the, if you will, private space, which could be inside you, or it could be a building or something, an institution. Whether the deen-dunya distinction is a temporal one, or can be a temporal one. Certainly in more modern usages of dunya and dunyawi that I am familiar with, the gesture is often to the transient nature of the dunya. That it might be ubiquitous, and that's one word that might describe it nicely, perhaps, but it is purely transient. Whereas deen is a kind of permanent thing. And how might this allow us, or would it perhaps allow us to think slightly differently about the categories? You could, of course, use the more familiar ones of I've just lost them, of worldly and otherworldly. So dunya as world, but that has a quite distinct Christian genealogy, otherworldliness. As opposed to deen, which I take it is not otherworldly in that sense. But if we think about temporality here, then I think the universality of the dunya that you ended with is really fascinating, because it's if you will, a universality premised upon transience, premised upon the vanity of this world, which is yet and therefore everywhere. It's transient, and yet it survives, and yet it contains, and yet it's ubiquitous, as I said, in that way. Does that make sense? That's one question. And the other had to do with the particularity of deen. And, so on the one hand, of course, it seems abstract because of that quotation you read at the very end. The, if you will, deen of non-Muslims is also called deen. It's not like only Muslims have deen and other people don't. So there's, and that is your argument, that is a large part of your argument. There's a kind of equivalence and availability of to think that. But I just wonder whether, are we talking about deen as a kind of abstract universality, or I don't, are we talking about a set of different particularities? I don't know if that is a difference without a distinction that I'm making here, but I just wondered because I was thinking of the term, the plural of deen, adyan, which is not so often used, and it seems to, at least in the Indian material that I know of, come re-emerge or emerge in the 18th, 19th centuries. perhaps slightly earlier in the late Mughal period. And that sort of makes sense because you're thinking of what Akbar and the Mughals are doing with the idea of deen and the deen-e-ilahi and all of this that Asfar Moin writes about. And their, what empire does to ideas such as deen. So it goes back to what you were saying. But before that, I mean, is the plural of deen used in this sense of abstract universality, or is it a kind of collection of, if you will, specificities? What kind of abstraction is it? Again, this might be a distinction without a difference.
Yeah, no, these are excellent questions, and thank you for them. To begin with the first, I've been thinking a lot about the spatialization of secularism a lot, and I actually had one of my grad students who is working on spatialization with another case, and this is a late 20th century case, I forget the name, but it has to do with a community and ritual sacrifice being another one of the central nodes around which this otherization takes place, right, on secularism's plane. It's interesting with deen and dunya. I mean, the way I find your characterization very interesting and creative and fruitful. I'm not sure if it entirely maps on to the way I've the historical reality I've encountered. So the first thing to know, which is interesting, is that, I mean, it's really hard to say where deen and dunya comes from within the Arabic etymological, in the case of Arabic etymology, but my own sense is that it comes from a spatial perspective. So it's actually the close and the far. So deen and dunya, when we see it in pre-Islamic poetry, it actually speaks of the nearness and the farness. And Bravman has written this excellent book in which he talks about this a little bit. But what I see in the medieval context, as things have settled, are two separate distinctions that I have to sort of work through. So there's the dunya and the akhirah of this life and the next life. Then there's deen and dunya. And I actually think deen and dunya map onto a spatial kind of boundary drawing, whereas the dunyawi and ukhrawi is obviously very expectedly temporal in nature. So we have two sorts of categorizations. And what's interesting about that is that when we see the dini and the dunyawi invoked in the cases of which I'm looking, whether in law or in politics, I think you do find it working to sort of, do this sort of conceptual spatialization work, right? Of drawing these boundaries of, okay, well, where does religion stop and where do we go beyond, and that sort of thing, right? And what's interesting about, and I'm just thinking now about secularism as a kind of distinctively modern European phenomenon, right? When we talk about secularism today as spatialized discourse, I think it even goes back to Locke, and when I was, rereading Locke with my students this quarter, it's really about creating a new universal secular human body, right? And it's about stripping away, this entire tradition that informs personhood, right, or informs a subject. And that's the entire process that Locke is outlining in order to create a secular public sphere, right? So we're talking about a public. When we're talking about a public, I think it's a distinctively modern phenomenon, and it would be anachronistic to use it in the medieval context. There might be creative ways to think through it, but when we think about the kind of Lockean public, it's sort of a mechanism of creating what I would say is this modern capitalist subject who is, able to only work according to the rationalist logic of the European Enlightenment, and therefore be far more useful to the ends of modernity, right? And this is Assad has written about, and everyone has written about, and it's been a fascinating sort of intervention. And so I think that is uniquely distinct about the kind of modern secular order in terms of spatialization. And so thinking about this graduate student of mine who's worked on this, you see this happening with respect to specific spaces about whether a church, and I think this case happened in Florida, where is the space in which the sacrifice can take place? And it's all about public order. The entire discourse is about the welfare of the people and that sort of thing. It even becomes nationalist. It's un-American to engage in ritual sacrifice, right? What does that even mean? And so that is a sort of entirely distinct thing. So when I'm thinking about it now, I'm thinking about spatialization in terms of the dini and dunyawi. I do want to separate it from that kind of spatialized discourse. Though I think this kind of conceptual space making and adjudicating is a kind of natural phenomenon among thinkers, especially jurists who are trying to do this sort of work. But the process by which that happens, the concrete effects of them, I think, are entirely different, precisely because the codes are different, right? And then finally, this question, I think you're right. I mean, what you do find is I would agree with your second formulation, right? I think it is a set of particularities that they're in, and that actually helps me think through this, right? Because maybe we're not really talking about universality per se. We're talking about a recognition of a set of particularities, which they view as mapping onto a certain kind of universal phenomenon. I think they would agree to that. And they use adiyan quite a bit in the medieval context, but really the standard term is milal, right? So there's millah, which really becomes the term for a religious community, whereas deen can have a sort of existential element to it, right? The individual person's deen. Millah always means a religious community. So milal becomes the standard term for representing various communities. So we have obviously this vast literature around milal wa nihal, right? The creeds and the religions. And it's actually interesting to think, in terms of what Professor Hurd was talking about, right? Why these categories are used and how and by whom and at what points they take on a particular significance, right? Because if you think about this classification literature of various milal, which is goes back to Shahrastani, who's the kind of high point, it dies down for a while, and then in the early modern period under the Ottomans, it picks up again. You have the translation of these works into Turkish. And this is all in the context of what historians now are calling confessionalization. So you have obviously the Ottoman Safavid divide, but the move, I would say, towards the modern state of creating a subject along the lines of a unified religious creed, right? And so I do think it sort of maps on to what the modern state does, right? And here I would actually say we have early modern modernities, right? We have multiple modernities, and we need to also think through that as a way of, in particular, that particular moment of the state in thinking of new ways of imagining our modern condition. But, I've said too much now, but these are very great questions, so thank you.
Thank you all. I mean, that's just very scintillating discussion all round. One of the, so Beth, I'm going to turn back to you, and I understand we've got sort of maybe 13 minutes left, and I still want to welcome, any of the participants. I don't want us to only hegemonize the questions. So if you want to put in questions, please feel free. But while I have the chance, I'm going to put mine in. So Beth, in a sense, at a certain point, you were talking about decolonizing religion and leaving behind the category of religion altogether. This reminds me of a number of conversations that we constantly have in religion departments about, what's going to happen to our department after we discard this term as a conceptual category, and the sort of politics of not making the case too hard, shall we say. But at the same time, what really, one of the things that struck me as an Islamicist, as you're talking about Santa Muerte, is this would be seen as a sort of like very problematic sort of cultic practice within an Islamic paradigm, certainly in modern times, but also in sort of pre-modern times. And I wanted to actually tie in Roshan with this to a certain extent, that, number one, is it meaningful for us to think in terms of, okay, we need to discard a category, or are these categories all just sort of the experimentation and contingent inventions of people at different points in time? And it gives us a great reason to exist as academics, so we can spend our careers writing about them. But beyond that, is this kind of like a kind of existential dance that academics and people are performing in various ways? In a sense, I got the sense that there is a kind of tendency towards recognizing particularism everywhere. And is that the universal that will ultimately subvert all of our sort of conceptual efforts at organizing these sort of interprinciples? I don't know, maybe a bit of a subversive question, and perhaps one I haven't thought through as well as I would like. But just to sort of add on to that, these sorts of practices with the saint of death, so to speak, how would you situate, Roshan, something like that within an Islamic sort of medieval paradigm, if there can be one, and just to think about how decolonizing religion in Latin America through decolonial theory in many ways is about sort of creating pluriversality, as they say, recognizing that there isn't a universal, that there are many universal projects. And is it useful to think of the medieval Islamic project as a universal project that is creating another particularism in effect that we've become a bit more conscious of in the present? I think I've sort of mixed in both of your presentations in that question, but I'd love to hear your reflections, Beth and Rushain, on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Usaama. The first thing I wanted to say is it seems like part of the challenge, we've been talking a lot about universality versus particularity, and it seems like part of the challenge to me would be to recognize the power of the taken for granted. And I've just put in the chat a book that may be of interest to Rushain in particular, and perhaps others as well, which is newly out by Elaine Volefant. And she's actually looking at French Catholic secularism, catholicité, and she's looking, it's called The Privilege of Being Banal. And so for me, part of the challenge is I don't see it really as an academic exercise, but rather as an intellectual and political project, which is to, first of all, to understand that which is seen as banal and to make it not banal. And that's that you could cast that as particularizing it. You could also cast it as understanding, perhaps a bit more modestly, because the particular, as Faisal kindly reminded us, always requires that universal. And perhaps we want to work to dislodge that tendency to be toggling between those two so tirelessly all the time. So the first is to recognize the power of the taken for granted, and then to perhaps think very carefully about how to present alternative perspectives that are not indebted to that paradigm, to that framing, that are working in a different conceptual grammar, that are working out of a different set of aesthetic practices and histories, that are not at all relating themselves back to that presumed universal, which we have now debanalized. And so that leads to unforeseen spaces, encounters, understandings, histories, sensibilities that I don't think we can neatly categorize in terms of the universal or particular, but rather we can, and maybe you're right, maybe we are falling back into like some sort of, just world of particulars. But I do think that there's a certain way of relating to that universal and of trying to problematize it and to dethrone it that puts us in a slightly different epistemological and political space. And the other thing is, I don't think all of this is academic, because I do spend a fair amount of time, often despite the best interests of my sanity, trying to translate some of these very complex, nuanced problematizations of politics, history, the secular, the religious, into public discourse, into more accessible language that becomes perhaps a resource for individuals who are engaged in, say, lawmaking. I've done congressional testimony just almost a year ago, who are involved in policymaking, who are eminent parts, play an eminent role in the media in setting certain kinds of conversations. And I, in a very modest way, try to just nudge them toward the possibility of some of these alternative perspectives. And I have found that people are often quite open, surprisingly open. And this reflects maybe what Rushain is saying, a very optimistic young person's perspective that I appreciate, is that no, it's not all for naught. And, it's not just in our ivory towers, especially you in Oxford, very ivory there. But, really there is some space for people want to be, they want to find a way out of the predicaments and the rigidities and the hate and, so much of the violence that we're seeing in this country right now, there is a real appetite, I think, for alternative ways of thinking and being and understanding. And so I'm optimistic about the possibility of conversations like this leading to some sorts of other conversations that then do have an actual impact, however modest, in public policy, in these legal debates. And I'm anxious to hear about what Santa Muerte would look like in an Islamic medieval context. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, just very quickly. I'm not a medieval Muslim jurist, so I can't say this definitively, but what I will say is that it would not have looked like how it looks today, right? And what you're studying. And it's precisely because when it came to the cultic or the particulars of religious traditions, practices, right? That's precisely where this autonomy was granted. Absolutely, really, right? We know, for example, of, very famously Zoroastrian ancestral marriages, though being totally at odds with Muslim morality, right, were famously allowed, right? And precisely that distinction I was talking about with the ibadat as being sort of protected realm, that these sort of practices would never have been, I think, first of all, they would not have been problematized in the way that they are in the secular order. And moreover, that wouldn't have been as central to the very maintenance of that social order, right? And what's really, I'm starting to think about now, what's interesting is, in thinking about that arrangement that took place then, is the stark divergence between two realities, right? So you have this theoretical reality of the protection of the particularity of a community, right? So it seems like you have nice communities who are just regulating themselves. And this is essentially the assumption, the kind of Assadian assumption, right? That they are all products of embodied traditions, that we are not, in the Lockean conception, these rational individuals that can all be subsumed within some sort of universal regulation, right? There's that implicit recognition on the part of the medieval jurists. But what's striking is that the historical reality is far more complicated because they were not siloed off communities, right? So even though they were theorizing this sort of particularity, what one finds, and I'm working on this in a different respect, thinking about how Sufis were like Christian at the same time they were Muslim, right? And also just so much historical work being done on, the Balkans and other places where you find literally a shared world. So it's not as if the pre-modern medieval reality was one in which you just had particularities, siloed off in their different districts within the cities, but actually a really robust culture in which people were interacting as humans with one another, despite their confessional differences, right? And that's the really striking thing. And I think this historical work is only going to increase. Jack Tanous has this wonderful book, massive book, The Making of the Medieval Middle East. And the second half of the book is, I think, groundbreaking work that will only be furthered in talking about the actual shared world that we encounter. And so I don't have an answer to this, but I do think a lot about this, this historical reality, which doesn't seem to map onto our vision of this dark ages of lack of plurality, of lack of actual syncretism, right? We really do find that. So those are just some scattered thoughts around that, but I think it's a fruitful one.
Thank you so much. I am very conscious of the time. We have maybe a couple of minutes and someone did put their hand up, but before we take that potentially, because we usually ask people to write their questions, so I have asked the gentleman. I just want to say, Beth, that I actually, I happen to be in Windsor right now at an interfaith sort of, I'm at Windsor Castle, actually, at the Queen's residence, so at St. George's House. And the last time I was here, we actually had the MP who acts as sort of the, I forget the exact title, but she deals with international religious freedom, which is, so I mean, this is why I appreciate your writing in these areas, because it is very accessible. It can be read and understood by a lawyer in her case who's become an MP. I don't think it wasn't a baroness. I think it was an actual Fiona, I forget her MP, but I recommended your book to her. I sent her an email with the title and link, and I hope, I mean, she expressed an interest in it. So, I hope it complicates the worldviews that were being discussed in that room. Fingers crossed. Thank you so much. We don't have the question, and I'm really conscious of time. I hope Vahid Nikpay will indulge us for not taking his question. But Faisal, I don't know if you want to call proceedings to a conclusion.
Thanks very much, Usaama. Thank you all in the audience, and thank you in particular, Beth and Roshan, really wonderfully stimulating presentations, and we really could have gone on. But I do hope we shall meet in person rather than simply online at some point. Roshan, it'll be good to meet you properly. Beth, it'll be wonderful to see you again. And with that, we will close this session, very successful one, I think. Thank you all, and we shall be in touch.
Thank you, Faisal.
Thank you. It was lovely to be here with you. Have a wonderful day.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.